Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. For anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Elaine Hutley. I'm a partner and national head of the employment team here at Irwin Mitchell, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Charlotte Rees-John, who's also a partner, but also head of our retail, leisure and hospitality sector. So Charlotte and I today are going to be talking to you about neurodiversity. Excuse me, stumbling. But before we get into the detail, we are on a webinar, but we really like to be as interactive as we possibly can. And there's a couple of ways that we do that. So hopefully any second now, popping up on your screens will be a link to Slido. So we've just got a couple of case examples where we'd really like to get your views on the case, and the way that we can do that is via Slido. So please join us on that. The other way is through the Q&A chat. So if you have any questions where we go through, we will be doing Q&A at the end. Please do pop your questions. Now, this is a really popular session, and so we are expecting that there's going to be quite a few questions. So please, could you include your name and your contact details in your question? Nobody else can see those, only Charlotte and I. And if we can't get to your question during the session, we'll drop you a note afterwards or do follow up with you to try and get you those answers. And then my last plea, and I will reiterate this at the end, is please could you complete our feedback form. It's really important for us to know what works well for you, but also for you to influence our future sessions so that we know what's a hot topic for you and so you get as much use of them as possible. So with that in mind, I'm going to move ahead. Next slide, please, Donna. What we're going to cover today is around neurodiversity. So what is it and why does understanding it matter? We'll look at common conditions. We'll look at neurodiversity in the context of a disability, but then we'll also move on to practical examples that will hopefully help you straight off the back of this call, so you can start thinking about how neuro-inclusive your workplace is, where you are on your journey and what more you can do. You can think about your obligations to introduce reasonable adjustments. You can look at your processes. So, for example, recruitment is often a hot topic, and also how you can create a neuro-inclusive workplace. But then also on the flip side, what you can do if you receive a complaint about a neurodiverse employee. It's really not a good start. I'm struggling with that word today. And so what I'm now going to do is hand over to Charlotte, who's going to tackle the first of those issues.
Thanks, Elaine. Hi, everybody. So let's kick off and let's start talking about what is meant by neurodiversity. So we've taken a definition from the CIPD, and they say it's the natural variation in human brain functioning. So basically all our brains work differently and all minds are unique. I quite like this stat that we have 84 billion brain cells which connect in billions of different ways. So we can't expect everyone to respond in the same way to environmental conditions. So let's just pause on that. Everyone's brain is different, so every individual is different. So we're going to be talking about neurodiversity today, and we might use some terms like neurotypical, but really what is neurotypical if every single person's brain has 84 billion brain cells? So really you could argue that everybody is neurodiverse and that we need to think about the fact that everybody thinks and approaches situations differently. But for the purposes of today, let's have a look at what is normally considered as neurodivergence. And there's some common conditions that are usually found under that umbrella. So that would include things like autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and many more. There's also some debate as to whether or not it could include conditions such as bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, and acquired brain injury. So there are lots of different conditions and diagnoses that might be covered under neurodivergence. And so it's really important that we should think about different ways of thinking. It's actually estimated that 1 in 7 people in the UK are neurodivergent, but this could be as many as 1 in 5, according to the CIPD. And as I say, actually, everybody's brains work a bit differently. So next slide. So on that basis, given how many people within our workforce this could impact, it's really important to understand some of the challenges that neurodivergent individuals can face in the workplace. Often these challenges are exacerbated because the workplace is set up to cater for neurotypical workers, and there's a lack of understanding and awareness of neurodiversity. So some examples, for example, somebody with autism may struggle with sensory stimulation in the form of light, so bright lights in the workplace. And that might lead to them being unable to focus at work with fluorescent lights overhead. And it's really important to remember that each individual, and I know I've already said this, but it's really important, so I'm going to keep repeating it, that each individual is different and will experience different challenges. So on the slide, we've put some of the challenges that a neurodivergent worker might experience. So communication challenges, eye contact, body language, appearing abrupt. We've seen when advising clients that there are challenges, potentially challenges around using Teams, using different forms of different forms of communication that we use now in the workplace. So somebody might not feel comfortable having their camera on, or they might not be looking at the camera. And it's these actual practical ways of working that we need to consider and look at for each individual on an individual basis. So there might be difficulty with ambiguous communication, literal interpretation. Giving feedback or receiving feedback, the way in which an individual receives feedback. I've touched on sensory challenges, so the lighting in an office, but also the noisy office environments. And we'll come on to look at practical ways in which we can support neurodivergent colleagues, but things like noise cancelling headphones, or at least having the availability of a quieter space, might be a way of being more inclusive. Even down to the office layout, so a highly cluttered workplace compared to a workplace that is more accessible or less cluttered. Needing more time to adapt to change and processing information differently. But again, I stress these are different challenges that may be faced, but may not be faced. And that's why it's really important that you have a good dialogue with a colleague to ensure that you understand the challenges that they particularly face. So moving on to the next slide, please. So obviously we've been looking at some of the challenges, but often, and if those on the call have children, particularly in the school environment, we now talk about superpowers. So neurodivergent individuals having superpowers, and what could some of those superpowers look like, and how could they translate into the workplace? Well, again, some examples on the slide. So the creative thinking, problem solving, increased productivity, different perspectives, increased efficiency, diversity of thought, strong sense of justice, hyperfocus, and attention to detail. So whereas there may be some challenges, there may also be some benefits of being neurodivergent. Again, it's really important to talk to the individual, assess the individual and the challenges and talents that they may have. An interesting comment made by the executive director of Head of Autism at Work. He's been quoted as saying, our autistic employees achieve on average 48% to 140% more work than their typical colleagues, depending on their roles. So that's quite significant. And in fact, some government departments in some countries and some organisations have actually been targeting neurodiverse talent, recognising the talents that they have and they're able to bring, which are particularly suitable to the roles that are being recruited for. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So although there are clear benefits around diversity of thought and the benefits that diversity of thought can bring to the workplace, and that's recognised, there are still significant barriers for neurodivergent workers in assessing and remaining in employment. Historically, due to a lack of awareness and understanding of neurodiversity, our workplace processes, our management practices, work environments haven't been set up to accommodate all neurodivergent people. And as such, some may find themselves marginalised by work cultures, processes, technology, which do not take into consideration their particular thinking style. Some of the more shocking statistics are that only 3 in 10 of autistic people are in any kind of employment, which is, I think, really quite shocking, and many of you may find shocking as well. So whilst there's been an increasing awareness of neurodiversity, and actually the number of diagnoses, another interesting statistic, between 1998 and 2018, the number of diagnoses rose by 780%. So that is a pretty staggering additional number of diagnoses. So we are recognising it, we are diagnosing it, but employers aren't necessarily keeping up, and we're not having sufficient conversations around neurodiversity in the workplace. In fact, 70% of employers say that EDI is a critical priority, but only 33% say neurodiversity is part of their EDI strategy or action plan. So it's absolutely becoming more expected. So it's becoming more expected from a job candidate perspective that we will, as an employers, have embraced neurodiversity, that we might have looked at it, and we're going to come on to recruitment in it shortly. But actually, in reality, for a lot of organisations, they don't feel that they have necessarily really got to grips with what having a neurodiverse, inclusive workplace would look like. So on that, if we can do our first Slido, again, obviously all confidential, but if you could rate on a scale of 1 to 10, where you feel as your organisation is on its neuro-inclusive journey. So 1 is not started, you've not started at all. 10 is you're absolutely smashing it, you've got a neuro-inclusive workplace and you think you absolutely no more work to do. And then, as I suspect, but I will wait for the outcome, anywhere in between. So if you can do that for us, the results should magically appear on the screen. There we go. Lots appearing. I'll give it a few more seconds. I've been told there's a bit of a delay, so I have to wait a few seconds for that to appear. Oh, there we go. Oh, there's lots of keeps changing about. Right. I think that's started to settle now. Yeah, so interesting. Yeah, I think around 5 obviously is the winner there. Around 32% of you are saying so some work has been done, you have started on the journey, so that's good, but obviously quite a lot more work to do in terms of having that neuro-inclusive workplace. And a few of you, which is, you know, great to recognise, haven't even started on that journey. And I suspect that number is higher than that in terms of if we look at organisations as a whole. So I'm going to hand over now back to Elaine, who's going to have a look at the legal definition and whether a worker needs a formal diagnosis.
Thanks, Charlotte. Such interesting statistics that Charlotte's just taken us through, and I've noticed on a Q&A a few people have asked for information of where that's come from. So if you would also like it, we'll prepare a pack that we'll send out to anybody who wants links to some of these resources. So please do pop your name and just say resources or something of that like, so we know what to follow up with you. I'm an employment lawyer. Of course, I'm going to talk to you about disability discrimination, but please don't make the assumption that every neurodivergent colleague is going to be disabled. So don't immediately put that label and put them in that pigeonhole. But we have got to talk about the context, because it is possible that they could meet the definition of disability. And therefore, you need to bear that in mind in terms of the support that we put in place for them legally, as well as morally and culturally having an inclusive workplace. So if we just recap, this will probably be really familiar to everybody or most people on the call. But a disability is a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So if you break that down into the 4 elements, we've got, is there a physical or mental impairment? The second one is, does that impairment have an adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities? I stress here, day-to-day activities, normal day-to-day activities, not work-related duties. Is it substantial? And the threshold for that is quite low. It just has to be more than minor or trivial. So the threshold isn't really high. It doesn't have to have a significant impact. It just needs to be substantial, which is more than minor or trivial. And is it long-term? So has it lasted, or is it likely to last 12 months? And one of the important points to bear in mind when we're looking at whether somebody has a disability is that we ignore the effects that any medication might have on them. So somebody, neurodiversity aside, might present to work and you might not realise because they're managing their condition through therapies and medication, but we ignore that for the purposes of saying, do they meet this threshold of a disability? Okay, so hopefully that's familiar to most of you. Next slide, please, Donna. So the question we often get asked is, do they need a formal diagnosis to be disabled? And back in the old days when I first qualified, many years ago, there was a requirement for there to be a diagnosis of a well-recognised condition. That has long since gone. So the answer to that is no, we don't need a formal diagnosis. It's back to the test that we just had on the previous slide that says they just need medical or physical impairment, and then we look at the effect of that impairment has on them. There's no need for a formal diagnosis. And generally speaking, I would say whether someone has a disability is not a particularly high threshold. What we consider it is a gateway provision. So you can have someone who is disabled, but that doesn't mean that they've been discriminated against. It just puts them in the realms of being able to ask a tribunal to say, have I suffered from discrimination? It's also worth bearing in mind at this point that whilst we don't need a formal diagnosis, it is a decision that's made by the tribunal and not a medical professional as to whether someone is disabled. So you can go off for occupational health and we would recommend it, or you can get a report and advice from their GP or a specialist that they're being treated by. But ultimately the tribunal will decide whether that threshold is met and whether somebody is disabled. So, and this comes to a question actually that I saw pop up when Charlotte was speaking, but I didn't want to preempt this slide. So you're going to have certain situations where you're going to have to approach with common sense and exercise your judgment as how to manage that situation. So the first is, for example, if a worker is displaying signs or symptoms of neurodivergence, and you think they might have a potential disability, but they haven't formally told you that yet, and there isn't a medical diagnosis, how do you approach that with the employee to discuss it with them and potentially ask for perhaps them to consent to a referral to occupational health? The answer is you need to do that sensitively, because if you ignore that situation, you could have constructive knowledge of the fact that they are disabled. And we're going to come on to that in a second to say, how do you navigate this situation? When do you have knowledge? When do you not? On the flip side, you might also be in a situation where you have no reason to suspect, but perhaps the employee comes to you and says either they have had a diagnosis, perhaps they've done the tests for dyslexia, or perhaps they've even used a bit of Dr. Google and they've decided that they do suffer with an impairment and that they have they meet the threshold of being disabled. Again, you've got to go into that with a very open mind. This is a fact-finding exercise, and have a sensitive conversation, because it comes back to what Charlotte was saying earlier of everybody is different and everybody needs to be treated as an individual, and you can't make assumptions, even where perhaps two colleagues have the same condition. It may affect them in different ways to different degrees, and your outcome and how you support them in the workplace and what you need to do by way of reasonable adjustments, for example, might be different. So sensitivity is key, but so is openness, and so is empowering not only you as HR colleagues, but also your line managers to not be scared of having those conversations, because we see that a lot. People don't say anything for fear of saying the wrong thing. So it's really important to have openness, to empower colleagues, but make sure they're having those conversations in the right way. And the reason why that's important to understand factually what's going on is, if an individual is disabled, it's not enough to say they didn't tell me. You will have potential constructive knowledge of a disability if you could be reasonably expected to know that they were disabled based on the facts and circumstances that are presented to you. So it could be, for example, reasons that they've given if they've been off absent, details that are included in fit notes, just general comments they make to you if, for example, they're struggling with the office environment, or observations that you make in relation to their performance and how they do their role. So you've got to be very open to possibilities. Okay, next slide, please, Donna. And it follows on from that constructive knowledge, which is health questionnaires. So Charlotte and I and the team here get lots of questions to say, but they didn't disclose that on their health questionnaire, or they've never told us. You can use health questionnaires, but only in very limited circumstances, and they can assist you in then having further in-depth conversations with employees, but don't treat them as the holy grail and the be-all and end-all, because just because it's not on a questionnaire doesn't mean that you won't have potential knowledge, or you couldn't be expected to know. So where can you use pre-employment health questionnaires? So as it says there on the slide, it's unlawful for an employer to ask any job applicant about their disability or health until they've been offered a job either on a conditional or an unconditional basis. The only exception to this is where the question relates to a person's ability to carry out a function that's intrinsic to the job, but, and this is our final bullet point, the guidance says this has to be applied narrowly. So it's not an easy threshold to get over, because it's held that it's only in very few situations where questions about a person's disability need to be asked, as opposed to a question about their ability to do the job. So it's how you phrase that question. You can't ask a pre-employment health questionnaire, say, are you disabled? Do you suffer from X, Y, and Z? But what you can do is say, is there anything we need to be aware of in terms of the requirements of the role that would need support and adjustments? So there's a subtle difference, but again, that's your building block for future conversations. Okay, next slide, please, Donna. And then I think I'm handing back to Charlotte about how we can create a neuro-inclusive workplace.
Thanks, Elaine. I'm busy reading lots of the questions that are coming through, but I hopefully am going to answer some of those in this next section. I'm going to go back to some of the findings, some of the research that's been done, and it's coming up on the slide there. So in 2022, a paper on autistic adults' experience of workplace adjustments, because we're going to look a bit more in these adjustments. A lot of the questions are coming through on what is a reasonable adjustment, how far do we have to go, cost, and those kind of things. So what this report found was that around a third of autistic employees did not request adjustments at work, but would have found them useful, so would have led to them being able to work more effectively. Almost a third reported feeling unable to discuss their adjustment needs at all, and fewer than 1 in 5 felt comfortable discussing this across their whole organisation. Difficulties requesting adjustments, including the onus being on the autistic employee to identify and advocate for adjustments, and worry about risk of repercussions of raising, unclear organisational pathways, And then, requests actually, if they did make a request, those requests being refused. And then if they weren't refused, them being poorly implemented, so continually fighting to keep them in place. So some of the findings of the experiences of autistic employees in the workplace. And why do we want to support colleagues? Well, of course, we want to support colleagues to make sure that they can achieve their full potential. And Elaine touched on it. Part of that is making sure that we are in a constant dialogue, but having effective conversations around reasonable adjustments and what they look like for the individual. That's going to be absolutely key. One of the other challenges is that many neurodivergent individuals have learned to mask their needs and difficulties. So particularly if they are adults and they have been neurodivergent all their lives, they may have put in place these coping mechanisms, ways of masking, but the toll that takes on a neurodivergent individual, it's a constant toll. And so that can lead to fatigue, that can lead to burnout. And again, it's not allowing that individual to reach their full potential. So creating that open, supportive culture where people feel comfortable talking about neurodiversity is really important. And making sure that as an employer that you've advertised, you've made it clear that you are willing to make reasonable adjustments for neurodivergent individuals, then they're more likely to feel comfortable reaching out for that support. So these are things that you can do in advance. This is about creating a neuro-inclusive workplace rather than dealing with after, when the requests are actually made. Obviously, the line manager, again, Elaine's mentioned that line manager is going to be absolutely key in terms of the understanding and the support that's available for an individual. The National Autistic Society, they found that the best outcomes for autistic employees is having strong relationships with their colleagues, especially their line managers. But line managers will need additional training. Again, as Elaine mentioned, many line managers, they want to do the right thing, they want to support, but they're also really worried about saying the wrong thing and about getting into trouble, about saying something that's inappropriate. And the only way that we can support a line manager is to give them that training, give them those tools and understanding so that they feel confident having those open conversations with their staff members. And if as an organisation you don't think that's practical, signposting to where that advice and support can be received. So it's not going to be the line manager. Where can an individual go to have those conversations? There may be, for example, like the practical guide, an easily accessible guide for employees to the kinds of reasonable adjustments that as an organisation you are prepared to put in place. And if that's advertised so employees can access it themselves, right, I think that I may have ADHD or I may have ASD, and I want to understand what my organisation might be able to do for me to support me in the workplace. There's an easily accessible guide. I can go and have a read of that, and then I'm going to feel more likely confident to be able to come to my line manager or to HR, whoever it is that we're signposting to be able to request those adjustments. If we move on to the next slide. So I'm going to come back to this duty to make a reasonable adjustment, because a lot of the questions, and I understand where these questions are coming from, is that practically it can be quite difficult to put in place a lot of the reasonable adjustments that might be requested, understanding when we have to do that. Obviously, there is a cost involved. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. So when is the requirement to make a reasonable adjustment triggered? So it's when there is a formal or informal arrangement at work or a physical feature of the workplace that puts the disabled person at a substantial disadvantage when compared to a non-disabled person. And we know as an employer, or we should know, we're reasonably expected to know that the individual is disabled for the purposes of the Equality Act. Then that is when we need to put a reasonable adjustment in place. So we really need to start with looking at that is there a substantial disadvantage? So is there a disadvantage that the individual faces? And then is the adjustment that's being requested going to remove or alleviate that substantial disadvantage? That's really important. An example that I often give when just in relation to reasonable adjustments is a case a long time ago that I had where someone was asking to be able to park right outside of a shop in the customer disabled parking bay. And the line manager, well-meaning, was like, well, yes, of course, you know, if you're disabled and that will assist you, then by all means park in that bay. But it was creating problems because there was only 3 bays and obviously they were meant to be for customers. And it turned out that the individual, although saying that they couldn't walk very far, was then managing to walk across the car park for a cigarette break 3 or 4 times a day. So it quickly became apparent that they weren't really not being able to park near the store was not placing them at a substantial disadvantage. So it is really important that you think through that test and think through what the reasonable adjustment is for, why it's being asked, and whether or not there's a substantial disadvantage that is being alleviated. Also, for a reasonable adjustment claim to be successful, the employer must know or ought to know both of the disability and of the substantial disadvantage. So a good case example of this is Glasson and the Insolvency Service 2024. And in this case, an employee with a stammer applied for an internal promotion ahead of an oral interview. He notified his employer that he'd need more time to complete his answers, which was permitted. Another applicant ultimately scored higher and was appointed to the role. Mr. Glasson sought to bring claims based on the fact that he went into restrictive mode, giving shorter answers to avoid stammering. The employer had no knowledge of this disadvantage, so the EAT concluded that it was not required to implement further reasonable adjustments. So just to break that down, it's not just knowledge of the disability, it's also knowledge of the disadvantage that the employee is at. So this communication is really, really important. It's not a case that an employee says, I need all these adjustments, put them in place, and you as an employer just have to say, yeah, absolutely, we're going to put all those in place for you. You can dig deeper than that to really establish what the disadvantage is and whether or not the adjustment that's being requested is going to impact on that. And also, if you don't know about the disadvantage, then you can't be expected to be required to put in place reasonable adjustments for it. So moving on to the next slide, and I suppose the $1 million question, what's reasonable? What is a reasonable adjustment? And how do you assess that as an employer? Again, Elaine mentioned about the bar for disability, for being classed as disability under the Equality Act as being relatively low. That is the case. It is not a particularly difficult test. And in terms of reasonableness of a reasonable adjustment, again, the bar is fairly low. The requirement on an employer is high. And there's no getting away from that. There will be factors taken into consideration. So it's ultimately it is an objective test as to what reasonableness is, so it will depend on the circumstances of the case. So things like what would be reasonable for a very large national PLC is going to be different to what is reasonable for, say, a small charity with 5 employees. So it's not that those things won't be taken into consideration at all. They will be, but you have to look at all the factors rather than just any one particular factor. And you'll need to systematically run through all the factors listed on this slide, basically, to work out whether or not the adjustments proposed are going to be reasonable or not. And if they're not reasonable, you're going to need to explain why. So again, what we quite often see is we do a great job of going off to occupational health to get advice on what reasonable adjustments might assist the employee. We get that report back, but then we don't necessarily put in place all the reasonable adjustments that are suggested in the report. There may be very good reasons for that, but we haven't articulated it. We haven't written it down anywhere. We haven't explained to the employee why we're unable to put in place the reasonable adjustments that are put in the report. And that's where we're going to face challenges if we end up with an employment tribunal claim. So just looking at some of those factors on the slide, will the adjustment alleviate the disadvantage? Number one, okay, often missed. So really make sure that we've thought about that and we've discussed that with the employee. Is the adjustment practicable? So, you know, we might often get examples of an adjustment that just isn't practical given the role that the individual undertakes. So, for example, if the individual is required to work in a workplace that has very bright lights and very loud music because of the nature of the environment, it might be that we can't remove the bright lights and the loud music, and therefore it's just not practical to put in place that adjustment. Cost is a factor, but I would be cautious with cost because the bar is quite high, but it will be different for your big organisation compared to your smaller organisation. Just on that again, with your big organisation, tribunals are not interested in the P&L of individual stores. So this store has a P&L of X, so it's going to impact them. They expect large employers to have a pot of money put aside to make reasonable adjustments for employees. So it goes on the overall size of the organisation rather than store by store. Does it disrupt the employer's activities? This is important. Okay, you don't have to put in place an adjustment that is going to have a particularly negative impact on your activities. But you need to think about it, and you need to have gone through this test, and you need to these steps, and you need to have articulated and explained to the employee how it disrupts the activities and why therefore it's not practical to make that adjustment. So we talked about cost, but do remember that there are also lots of ways of getting support that are free. So access to work is a really good example. There are lots of charities, lots of organisations that will come into your organisation and help you to support a neurodiverse individual at no charge or at a low cost. So you need to make sure that you've explored all those avenues and opportunities. And then, yeah, we've discussed those other 2 points on that slide. Just one more point on reasonable adjustments is that there is a case which to be aware of, that if it isn't absolutely clear whether or not the adjustment will alleviate the disadvantage, you should give it a go. Okay, so if we're not sure, it may not, then you could consider making that adjustment on a temporary basis, like a trial. So you could have a trial period, right? For 3 months, we're going to work on you coming into the office an hour later in the morning, and see if that alleviates the substantial disadvantage. That's quite a good way of testing whether or not something is actually a reasonable adjustment without making that permanent change. Quite often what I see with clients is that they throw everything at a situation. So they want to make lots of adjustments. They make loads and loads and loads of adjustments on a permanent basis. And actually, there hasn't been any sense check over time on the impact of those adjustments on the individual and also the wider organisation. So a trial period could be a good way to go. So next slide. Oh no, we've moved on to the next slide. I went back in time. So just on this slide, there are just some examples of some of the reasonable adjustments that may be required for an individual. But as we've said numerous times, it's really important to talk to the individual. And if you're in doubt, you need to get that expert advice, whether that's through occupational health or it's through a third-party organisation. That is how you would really look at whether or not the adjustments are reasonable and whether or not they're going to alleviate that substantial disadvantage. What you mustn't do, and again, which we see quite often, is say, well, my child has ADHD, my sister is autistic, my friend is dyslexic, and therefore I know what adjustments are going to support you. We're not medical experts, and each individual is different, and so we need that external if we want to, particularly if we are saying that we can't put in place a reasonable adjustment, or if we're in doubt that it's going to alleviate a substantial disadvantage, we need that expert advice. Okay, so next slide, please. We're just going to do a quick case example. So Mr. B worked as a telephone advisor for a charity. He was given a trial in another team which provided advice via instant messaging service. Mr. B did well in the role. However, his instant messages often contained spelling and grammar mistakes. When questioned about these errors, Mr. B said he suspected he might have dyslexia and was considering taking a test. Notwithstanding this, he said he was comfortable in the role rather than working on the telephones. Despite receiving good feedback from clients, the charity said Mr. B's spelling errors didn't look good for the charity. The charity confirmed Mr. B had failed his trial period on this basis, and he was told he must go back to working on the telephones. He resigned. He brought a claim for a failure to make reasonable adjustments. He claimed that the reasonable adjustments would have included providing specialist software, a period of work-based coaching via Access to Work, extra time for reading and writing, support with written aspects of the job, for example, having a colleague proofread work, receiving written confirmation of verbal instructions, a quiet place for reading or writing anything that was complex, and having an electronic spell checker. In its defence, the charity argued that Mr. B didn't have any formal diagnosis and they would need this to understand what adjustments were necessary. So, quick Slido. Was Mr. B held to be disabled, and did he win his claim? What do we think? Let's test, see whether you've been listening to Elaine and I over the last 40 minutes. Okay, give it a few seconds. So, was he held to be disabled, and did he win his claim? Okay, so I think we can safely say that most people think that he was disabled and would win his claim. A few in the know, but most saying yes. So the majority are right on this occasion. He was held to be disabled and he won his claim for failure to make reasonable adjustments. And the case was Bullos v Shelter, the National Campaign for Homeless People Limited, 2018. Again, we can provide these details afterwards if you'd like them. And in this particular case, the tribunal found that regardless of the absence of any formal medical diagnosis, comes back to what Elaine was saying, he'd made his manager aware he was facing difficulties and that he suspected he was dyslexic, and that was enough. It was sufficient to give his employer constructive knowledge of his disability, and that the employer could reasonably expected to know of the disability, and the duty therefore to make reasonable adjustments was triggered. It's about looking at the effect of his impairment, regardless of the cause of it or any formal diagnosis. And the only adjustment that had been considered by Shelter was a return to telephone work, and that wasn't enough. If they'd considered other reasonable adjustments, then they wouldn't have been in the situation they were in. But as it was, they hadn't gone far enough, and they hadn't even considered whether or not any of those other adjustments that Mr. B was now suggesting could be reasonable. So they lost their case. So it just reiterates a lot of the points that Elaine and I have been saying, that it's really important that if you're aware or should be aware, if somebody makes you aware, or you have your own there are signs that make you think that somebody might be neurodiverse, that you're having those conversations with them, and if necessary, going for external support, occupational health or otherwise. Okay, so looking at we've talked a lot about the difficulties, and we've talked about the reluctance to disclose neurodivergence due to fear of stigma or stereotyping. And a lot of these difficulties, it has been suggested, and I alluded to when I was talking earlier, was that they might be overcome if employers implemented there's a Buckland review, and that suggests and it describes an inclusive by design, a workplace that is inclusive by design. So rather than waiting for an employee to say, I'm neurodiverse, I need some adjustments and support, bearing in mind the number of employees that are likely to be neurodiverse, that we design our workplaces with that in mind. And not just our workplaces, our systems, our processes, and as I say, we're going to look at recruitment. So that might include providing quiet rooms. It could having that guidance accessible to them, policy online where they can go and have a look at potential adjustments that can be put in place. But it's about being proactive, thinking in advance as to how you can make that workplace more inclusive. Okay, so there's a good case study on the slide, but I'm going to move on, conscious of time. I'm going to hand back to Elaine just to have a look at recruitment in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Charlotte. And I've seen so many questions coming in that I really wanted to ask you about, because it's all about reasonable adjustments, but we have got to be conscious of time. So we will come back to you if we can't cover all those at the end. So keep them coming in. And we'll share resources and advice with you. But we're going to concentrate now on the recruitment process, because at the very start of this session, Charlotte mentioned that actually only 3 in 10 autistic people are in employment. And she also touched on how with these superpowers, some organisations are really targeting neurodivergent workers to bring them into the workplace. And the recruitment process is a key part of that, because it's been identified as actually quite a big barrier, or being quite problematic to neurodivergent workers to gain employment. And Charlotte mentioned then the Buckland review, which we can share with you. That has identified a number of factors in the recruitment process that are easily alleviated if we just know that they're potentially problematic. So, for example, they've identified that questions along the lines of tell us about yourself and your achievements can put neurodivergent people at a disadvantage, because, for example, it identifies some autistic people might be overly honest about their weaknesses. They might struggle with eye contact during that general conversational piece. They might also lack confidence because of bad experiences that they've had previously. And hypothetical questions like that, which are intended to be icebreakers and to settle people in, actually have the opposite effect for neurodivergent people, because it puts them in an anxious and stressful state, which then further impairs their performance during the rest of the interview, rather than what the aim is to settle them in, make people comfortable, to then go on to more detailed, perhaps technical questions. It's also important when you're thinking about the environment for the interview is the approach that your interviewer takes, because there's often a common misconception, and we've seen this with unconscious bias before, where it's thought that a cultural fit equals someone who matches my body language, my communication style, which is neurotypical, and therefore neurodivergent colleagues or people can be seen as perhaps abrupt, evasive. They might give shorter answers and not elaborate because of that nervousness and that anxiety, which then puts them at a disadvantage. So it's really important, whoever you have going into an interview process is aware of that and avoids making those assumptions. You might also be losing potential candidates by the way that you draft your job descriptions and advertisements. So before you even get to the interview process, you may have put off some really brilliant candidates because your job descriptions are too long and and cover every possible element of the role, because this was considered by the Buckland Review that explained that many people who are autistic will see that as an absolute requirement. So all of those tasks that you list out and that you include detail of, and then they consider that the role is beyond their capabilities. So the advice from the Buckland Review is see how succinct you can make them and focus on the key tasks, and try to avoid having nice haves within the job description if these could be considered to be must-haves by neurodivergent applicants. So it's just, don't do what you've always done. If we're trying to design an inclusive workplace, think about each of the steps along the way. We're also seeing at the moment, we did a session on it recently about AI and how businesses are using AI. One of the tools that's available and can be used during the interview process is to analyse eye contact during interviews. But again, use of an AI tool that does that might put someone who's neurodivergent at a disadvantage. And any AI that might be used, for example, to screen candidates might discount an applicant where there's a gap in their CV. And what we do know from the research and the statistics is that neurodivergent people often have gaps in their CV between work. So again, it's things like that that you might not think of that will rule out potential candidates, either because they won't apply to you or they get sifted out as part of your process. So lots to think about there. Next slide, please, Donna. So if you're not going to ask those hypothetical questions, or if you're sitting there thinking, well, that's all great, Elaine, you've told me the problems, but what do I need to do? What can I think about replacing it with? The good news is it's not difficult, it's not costly, it's not big changes. Actually, lots of the changes that you can make to your recruitment process are quite simple. And we've included them there on the slide. The one that I really like, and it does make you stop and think about the practical tests. And the Buckland Review gave an analogy that said, if someone is applying for a job as a violinist in an orchestra, they're not asked to tell the interviewer something about their achievements playing the violin. They are asked to play the violin. And I think that's a really good one to bear in mind. Say, is there a different way that you could assess a candidate without just asking them to explain, to sell themselves to you, to explain their achievements? So tasks that can be completed either at the interview or in advance. But also, you might have heard that John Lewis recently has been sending candidates the questions that are going to be asked at interview in advance, so that people can consider them and have the time, the space and the ability to do so. So again, not rocket science. We just need to think practically about what will give candidates the ability to shine, and for neurodivergent candidates not to be put at a disadvantage. Okay, next slide, please. We've got a case now, so a Slido is going to be coming up shortly. This is the last one, so please do take part. It's been brilliant so far. So this is a recruitment case. So Mr. M had dyspraxia and applied for a role at ABC Limited. The applicants had to complete a short online application form. Mr. M emailed the HR team attaching his CV, and he provided information about his dyspraxia and how this affected him. He asked in bold capitals that ABC Limited permit him to make an oral application rather than the online form because of his disability. A senior HR manager emailed Mr. M to explain that he needed to complete the online form, but he should let them know if he was struggling with any aspect of it. He didn't respond and didn't explain specifically that his dyspraxia meant that he couldn't create a username and a password on the form. He replied to confirm that he was happy to do the online form over the phone and would prefer to make an oral application, but he didn't phone ABC Limited for fear of being laughed at, because he'd had a bad experience previously, and the HR manager then didn't call Mr. M. He wasn't able to make the application because he couldn't create the username and password, and so he brought a disability discrimination claim, arguing that ABC Limited had failed to make reasonable adjustments. So hopefully the Slido is up on your screens, and we're asking you to vote on whether he won or not. So again, if we just recap on what Charlotte was saying earlier, the duty to make reasonable adjustments arises when you know of the disability and you know of the disadvantage. Oh, look at the results on this one. This is a close call. So we're almost 50-50 on whether you think that he won or not. But we're slightly edging ahead with the yeses. And I wish we could go into more detail so I could see whether you think, well, yes, he was disabled, but did they know about the disadvantage, or whether you're wondering whether he's disabled or not. Yeses have slightly got it. So I think we'll call it there. And the yeses are right. And what the tribunal looked at in this case, so they did take on board that he did not explicitly say that because of his dyspraxia, he couldn't create a username and a password. And that was the specific disadvantage that he was experiencing. So the tribunal did acknowledge that. But what the tribunal said was that the employer did have constructive knowledge. So it was reasonable to expect them to know of the substantial disadvantage that he was at. And the reason they reached that decision was because he put them on notice that he suffered with dyspraxia, and he explained that this was causing him problems with the online form, and that was enough to get him over that threshold. The tribunal also decided that there was no good reason why the HR manager or someone couldn't have picked up the phone to ask him what his particular problem was, and it wasn't reasonable to expect him to reply by email in light of the difficulties he'd already explained to them, because he confirmed his dyspraxia and he's also said why this causes him difficulties. So he'd already met that requirement to put them on notice. So the importance of this case is to highlight, actually, as an employer, you have to be proactive to respond to requests for reasonable adjustments. You can't expect the employee, and you can't put the onus on them to kind of give you infinitum a list of requests. It's our responsibility as an employer to consider and to implement reasonable adjustments. Ideally, the employee will cooperate with us in that process. If they don't, there's been some questions, say, what if they don't agree to an occupational health report? What if they don't share details? Well, then you can't be criticised too highly, but that's not a free pass for you to do nothing. You should still do as much as you can with the information that you have available. Okay. And then I'm just going to hand back to Charlotte now for some practical tips while we wind up. Thanks.
Okay, so conscious of time, so what I want to do is just highlight some of the challenges. A lot of the questions have been around what if there aren't any adjustments, or if the adjustments mean that the individual can't do their job. So their job might be they might be dyslexic, and they're required to have a very high level of attention to detail in a piece of written work. The requirement is for you to consider whether or not there are any adjustments that will alleviate the substantial disadvantage. It is not for you just to employ the individual if they can't do the job. Okay, so what you've got to consider is, would there be any for that particular case, would there be any software that you could introduce that would assist the individual to overcome the disadvantage that they're placed at as being dyslexic? If there isn't, if you can't overcome the disadvantage, then you would obviously take advice, because it's quite tricky, but you are likely to be in a position where you could decide that you couldn't employ that individual in that role. And a lot of the questions have been around that. So the important thing is that you've considered it. You've considered whether or not there are any adjustments that can be made. But if there aren't, ultimately you don't have to continue to employ that individual. But that takes a bit of time, and preferably you would have occupational health support if the employee agrees to that. The other challenge that we see, that I just want to touch on very quickly, is around where there might be complaints about the neurodiverse colleague in the workplace, and those complaints might come from colleagues or clients, customers, people who are engaging with them. What's really important here is communication. Okay, so we really need to be trying to preempt any challenges that may come about because of anything that that might lead to a complaint. So talking to the colleague and asking them for permission, for example, to speak to new recruits or colleagues about their neurodiverse condition and how it impacts them, so that there can be transparency around things like, well, yes, that individual, you may notice that Charlotte is particularly direct sometimes in terms of the way in which she delivers feedback. She recognises this as part of her neurodiversity, but so don't take it personally, and be aware that if you prefer her to provide you with the feedback in writing rather than in a one-to-one, then that's something that we can arrange. So it's looking at where the complaint might come from and putting in place steps to alleviate that, so that you're basically putting in place an adjustment to alleviate the disadvantage that the neurodiverse colleague is placed at as a result of their neurodiversity. But what you can't do is just go, oh, well, this person is causing offence to colleagues, or allegedly offence to colleagues and customers, and therefore we're going to treat it as a misconduct issue. It's not going to be a misconduct issue. It's going to be a matter to be discussed and see whether or not that disadvantage can be alleviated. So we've got 1 minute over. Lots and lots of questions have come through. So if you've left your details, we will come back on that. There's also been some requests for some kind of general guidance, and as part of our follow-up, we will be providing some Q&As so that you can get that general guidance. We're also, again, just to repeat, just to fill in that feedback form. It really is important for us to get that feedback so that we can make these sessions as useful as possible in the future. Have I missed anything, Elaine?
I don't, thank you. Just thank you to you, Charlotte, and thank you to everyone joining. Some of the questions are quite specific on reasonable adjustments. Some came in as you were going through the slides, so I think they might have been answered. But I think just to say, Charlotte and I and the team, if you are dealing with a particular question and you want to know whether it's reasonable or not, every case will be different. So we're happy to support you and talk you through that, of what the options are and how you manage it. And then we've also just had a couple of questions to say, for example, well, if a reasonable adjustment is a change to working hours, should that be done through the flexible working policy? Again, I wouldn't overcomplicate it. You don't need to make a colleague go through a flexible working policy if you're talking to them about reasonable adjustments, because you're confusing two issues. Because the question is, are the adjustments reasonable? Not, can it be accepted or declined based on the test for flexible working? So if you are dealing with anything like that and you would like some support or some guidance, please let us know, and we're happy to talk you through it. It won't be complicated, but we'll keep you on the right track. But otherwise, thank you everybody for your support.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.